How communist was the Incan Empire? An explanation by the Andean archaeologist Commodore Coco. When people talk about the Inca as socialist or communist, what they are emphasizing is the redistributive economy and perceived equality of its subjects. For the sake of simplicity, I will focus on the goals and practices of Inca economic distribution and how 20th century authors understood it. Imagine you're in the 1920s. No, not that 20s. Take off the flapper dress and stop calling everyone dame. It's the 1920s in Peru. Relations with Chile are cooling, Lima is modernizing, and foreign and local archaeologists are revealing to the world Peru's rich cultural heritage, and all just in time to celebrate the centennial of your independence from Spain. Booming businesses in North America have attracted the eye of President Augusto B. Leguía. The Criollo leader, who cooed his way into a second presidency in 1919, is welcoming foreign investors to Peru and rapidly industrializing the urban and mining economies. Perhaps too rapidly, you think. Peru's rural economy is still stuck in feudalism, and would continue to be until the 60s. The independent, Republican Peru has not done any better by its miners and other extractive workers than the Spanish Empire had. The last thing the country needs is the violent, and usually unconstitutional, methods by which Leguía has forced capitalism upon it. You've been to Europe and befriended Marxist and socialist theorists. You were there for the start of the Soviet Union, but you've also lived in Italy and seen firsthand the rise of the National Fascist Party. You are inspired by the socialist parties that seem to be gaining ground in the US, Britain, and elsewhere. Nevertheless, you are bothered by the Whig history latent in Marxist theory. These Marxists really like to talk about the progress of history and the inevitable march towards communism. Typical explications of socialism are tied up in European ideas of economy, of wealth, and of labor. They are set in post-feudal states with demographics and histories entirely unlike that of Peru. How can they possibly account for the Latin American experience? Where does the violence of colonialism fit in Marx's grand historical narrative? What is the role of the oppressed indigenous population in socialism? These are the questions José Carlos Mariátegui found himself asking in 1924. A longtime advocate of workers' rights and indigenous solidarity, Mariátegui had fled his native Peru to Europe for fear of political persecution by the Leguía regime. Upon his return, he developed a romantic Marxism that eventually would come to define the Latin American left. Like many ideological threads in the 20th century, Mariátegui's Marxism recognized the soundness of Marx's materialist analysis, critique of capitalism, and political goals, but found his historical perspective, in both directions, lacking. The bulk of his theory is best presented in Siete Ensayos de Interpretación de la Realidad Peruana. Mariátegui argued that indigenous Andeans were uniquely situated for a socialist revolution due to their long history of communal land ownership and enduring resistance to the individualizing pressures of capitalism. The central dialectic of Mariátegui's writing is that of the pre-capitalist, indigenous past and a utopic socialist future that could only be arrived at by looking backwards. He pedestals the Ayllu, a traditional Andean socio-economic group based on real or imagined kinship, as a sort of proto-communist society in miniature. The Ayllu is most well known as the core of Inca's social and political hierarchy, the unit by which communities across the Andes became legible to the state. In this organization, Peru's indigenous population found remarkable resilience. In indigenous villages where families are grouped and where bonds of heritage and communal work have been extinguished, strong and tenacious habits of cooperation and solidarity that are the empirical expression of a communist spirit still exist. The community draws on this spirit. It is their body. When expropriation and redivision seem about to liquidate the community, indigenous socialism always finds a way to reject, resist, or evade it. Now, if you think this sounds a bit Noble Savage-esque, you'd be right. Mariátegui wrote an awful lot about rural Peru for a guy who spent most of his life in Lima and lived in Europe for a few years. Mariátegui overgeneralizes the past and present of indigenous Peru, and there's a discriminatory ignorance towards non-Quechua indigenous groups. Yet, Mariátegui was influential in promoting the idea of the Inca as a communist state. Anthropologist George Murdoch was absolutely thinking of Mariátegui when he wrote in 1934. Inca socialism, absurdly idealized by some writers and as unjustly dismissed as a fiction by others, emerges from a survey of the facts, not as the product of a utopian dream, but as a natural adaptation to a special set of conditions. Socialism, linked with democracy and Marxian theory, was consistent in Peru with monarchy and aristocracy. The Inca system exerted a leveling influence, creating a uniform standard of living throughout the empire. But if it thus realized the ideal of equality, it was equality only within a given social class. But was he right? Barely. Inca influence was rarely leveling. Take the Inca heartland around the capital Cuzco. Alan Covey's survey of the Sacred Valley just north of the city shows that Inca intervention was sporadic and rarely substantial. Excavations at Picara Pantiligla, a highland settlement overlooking the valley, show that the Inca arrived at the site very early in their expansion but did not continue to interact with the community regularly. Over the next century, however, Inca royals would construct the monumental sites like Ollantaytambo and Piac on the valley floor. These sites brought extensive infrastructure and commerce that greatly benefited neighbors. This was far from a leveling influence. If anything, 2 centuries of Inca intervention in the Sacred Valley contributed to cultural divergence between valley bottom farmers and the horticulturalists and herders living in the uplands. The colonial documents Murdoch and Mariátegui would have based their ideas on dramatically overstated the degree of homogeneity and centralization of Inca politics and economy in the Cuzco heartland. Rather than a blanket investment in the region to integrate communities into a redistributive state, what we see instead are strategic interventions of ideological power into highland sites like Picara Pantiligla and of economic power at key points of trade or resource extraction. The same is true of Inca provinces. For instance, the site of El Abra in northern Chile had been a copper mine for centuries before the Inca arrived. The mining was small-scale and largely household-based, with most processing steps occurring in the same place. After the conquest, the Inca built new complexes for the mining work that reorganized the entire chain of production into discrete steps. There were even discrete buildings for eating and for sleeping. Yet at Casillo de Lampos, in central Chile, a similar level of economic intensification occurred, despite no interference from the Inca. Instead, it appears that locals took advantage of Inca infrastructure that had been built nearby to increase their own mining output. They built their own structures alongside the closest Inca road and continued to produce copper in the traditional, domestic fashion. The Inca presence indirectly, and probably unintentionally, eased transport and increased trade. Similarly, the Chronicle of Spaniarduyo Mogolón tells us that the Inca had administrated the Ellis of the Calca Valley in South Peru via tidy, tripartite political units from centralized outposts. But census records are only loosely congruent with this depiction, and suggest an unwieldy forcing of local toponyms and Ellis into the Inca system. Archaeological surveys of the valley do not find singular loci of Inca imperial power. Rather, there is a scattering of evidence for decentralized Inca control. In the lower valley, Inca presence was followed by rapid settlement expansion radiating out from new Inca administrative centers. In the upper valley, the Inca built on extant political centers and elevated local rulers as their puppets. Were food and fineries redistributed through these administrative centers? Of course they were. Both domestic and ritual assemblages of artifacts from sites across the empire show the presence of both locally produced goods and imported imperial goods. Does that make them socialist? Not in any modern sense of the word. Material reciprocity by the Inca state was much more concerned with statecraft than with any ideal of equality, redistribution, or providing for needs. The Inca Mita system of labor taxes and Mitmaak populations of relocated laborers existed to continually reassert their position as the provider of elite goods. It was essential for the Inca to control trade routes from the coca farms on the eastern slopes, the mines of the Bolivian highlands, and the corn fields of the Pacific River valleys, not because they wanted to redistribute coca, bronze, and beer to their citizens, but because their power derived from their ability to provide citizens across the region with these goods. Reciprocity was a showy political act wherein the Inca might gift local chiefs with chicha corn beer and finely decorated arroballo jugs in the Calanca town square built by the Inca on their first encounter as a stamp of imperial presence. This redistribution, of course, was highly differential. The most distant provinces, and those most likely to protest, received the most chicha and the largest arroballos. Master masons were always recruited via the Mita to help construct imperial palaces or tambo way stations in the most politically contested places. Buildings in the Inca style but cruelly constructed with local techniques can be seen in the towns most content with Inca rule. In true imperial fashion, the Inca selectively extracted and distributed resources to serve their own goals. What does this mean for the question of socialism? Early 20th century writers saw in the Inca some level of equality and communal ideology. As I've hopefully demonstrated, this was not present under the Inca Empire. Inca's engagement with their subjects was strategic and politically motivated, choosing to intensify, exploit, or ignore local economic activities as best served them. The sense of community that Mariátegui ascribes to the rural Peruvian was, for the Inca, much like the American sense of freedom, a unifying ideological abstract that they could cite in the name of whatever it was they wanted to accomplish in a region. Mariátegui's Inca was mostly a fabrication of modern indigenismo movements that needed to promote a sense of solidarity across the Andean region. That process is an entirely different question. The end.